to you, Jeff.
Dum-de-dum-dum.
Okay, where you at? Home. Right, there we go. Right, just got the link now, so I'm going to send you that in an email now, Jeff. And let me know if you get it. Okay, it's sent. Right. See if I can...
Okay, here it is.
Right.
Come on. There we go.
Right. So while you're doing that, Jeff, I'm just getting all the links out to social media. So, right. Twitter. There you go. Patreon. There you go. Right, so is everything set up on your end then, Jeff? Can you see everything?
I think so. I think I have it blocked, the screen blocked, so I can. Actually, it's funny. The only way I can get all the layers layered right is if I put your video feed on top of my face.
Right.
Which looks a little weird, but there you have it.
Right, yeah, because just as well, I didn't mention, once the questions get coming in as well, I'm going to switch off my video mic, just sometimes it can interrupt your feed, but I will be listening the whole time just to let you know, so if you need me, just shout me if you see what I mean.
Okay, yeah, it looks like already getting some questions.
Just bear with us, guys. So, yeah, as you know, with Jeff Guinn, an aircrew interview favourite, of course. Jeff, it's been quite a while since we last spoke, but what have you been up to since the last time we chatted, which I think was in a Q&A?
Oh, well, the last, a lot has happened since then. The biggest part is I left Europe at the end of November. I changed airplanes from the 757 to the 767, and now I'm based in Memphis rather than in Cologne, Germany. The reason for that change was the EU has rules about how long you can work in the European Union before it basically limits it to 4 years, 11 months, because by EU rules, if you work there longer than that, then you get to take advantage of EU benefits. Mm-hmm. So they kick you out for a year or more. But it's odd. They tax you right from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I'm moved back to Boise, Idaho, and right now I'm flying out of Memphis. I happen to be in Memphis at the moment, sitting in a hotel waiting to go to Monterrey, Mexico tomorrow morning. But enough of that. Let me roll right into the questions. Steve at the top, Stephen 19706, asked if I would have taken part in Operation Eldorado Canyon if I hadn't left the Air Force for a couple of years. And the background on that is I did get out of the Air Force for a while, and I worked for 2 years at an electrical engineering company in Southern California before I decided I missed the flying and the people too much and got back in. Anyway, during that time, was when Eldorado Canyon happened. And just a little side note, I was working with the electrical engineering company I worked with. One of the things we did was talk show radio management, which is kind of interesting since that's sort of what we're doing right now. Anyway, I happened to be in the studio, the Network One radio studios. They were doing a show we were supposed to be doing a psychologist, a TV, radio psychologist call-in show, a lot like this one. And the moment it was supposed to debut, President Reagan came on and announced the raid. So of course we got canceled. So it's kind of interesting that I'm doing sort of a talk show now. I was doing a talk show then, and it was about Eldorado Canyon then and now. So I wouldn't have been there. I wouldn't have taken part in Eldorado Canyon because I flew the F-111E at Upper Hayford. And the F-111E was a totally analog airplane. We used ancient, well-worn, hand-tooled bombing techniques that really weren't, conceptually speaking, any different than a B-17 would have used. And technology had overtaken us by that point. The F-111F, of course, had paved tack and laser-guided munitions, and it just had to have precision to do the kind of mission they were doing. So I would have, had I been in England at the time, I would have just been sitting and watching along with everyone else, unfortunately. Let's see. Ian Klaproth asks, did the Raven and Aardvark pilots interchange from time to time? Well, we did in the sense that I know there were some guys who went from one to the other as assignments, but I don't think that happened too much because the missions, even though flying the airplane was the same, that part was really the least difficult part of the problem. And the missions of the Raven and the Lizards, as we called the ones with the camouflage, the Ravens and the Lizards, they were so different. You just can't go from one to the other without a significant amount of training and getting spun up and practice and all that other stuff. So no, it didn't happen very much. I know at Fighter Weapons School we worked with the Raven guys, but other than that, it really didn't happen too much. Freckle Puny, it's kind of a funny name. F-111 or Tornado? That's a pretty open-ended question. I think in terms of capability, of raw capability, the F-111 was the better airplane. It went faster. Particularly the F-111F with the paved tack had the greatest amount of tactical flexibility, because when the paved tack pod's in the center line, then you can come off target any direction and still keep the pod, the laser on the target. And that's something even that, like the F-15E is an extremely capable airplane, but it's limited in its tactical flexibility because it has to come off target in a certain direction in order to keep the target eliminated. Anyway, with the F-111 being faster and carrying more fuel, it had more range. And so I think in terms of the ground attack role, certainly the F-111 was better. And I'm not really that familiar with the Tornado. I think it was supposed to be a multi-role fighter, but I think it turned better than a 111. So it'd be better at air than a 111, but I think its performance compared to other air-to-air fighters was probably kind of limited. So in the ground attack role, it'd be the 111. If it was multi-role, then a Tornado was probably a little bit better, but I'm not sure if it was enough better to really make it work as a multi-role airplane. Andrew Potter asks, which UK plane would I have most liked to have flown? The Tornado. I'd want to be able to see firsthand if my suspicions about the Tornado are true or not. Sim Sedlow. Now, of course, I'm sorry, going back to Andrew, that temporary airplane. I think if we were to look at any UK plane, well, I'd be right there with everybody else, and I'd want to fly a Spitfire. But that's probably no surprise. Sim Sedlow asks, what were the ejection limits of the crew capsule? It was 0, if I remember correctly, and if I was at home, I still have my F-111 flight manuals, and I could check for sure, but I'm pretty certain it was 0 altitude and 50 knots because the capsule did get a certain amount of lift coming in the way the capsule was shaped, but there was 0 and 50 knots, and it was pretty reliable within the envelope. I think there were only 2 out-and-out failures of the ejection system in the entire history of the airplane, and that was they were both due to the same thing. And one of them actually killed the best friend I had at the time when I was first stationed at Cannon Air Force Base. The ejection sequence of that thing was pretty complicated, and once the rocket burned out and it got to maximum altitude, there was a stabilization chute that would come out the back of the capsule to keep the thing pointed forward. And then once that was done, the main chute would come out. And the first time the failure happened, the main chute got hung up in the brake and stabilization chute, and then nothing happened, and the capsule hit the ground hard and died. And a recommendation was made to blow the brake and stabilization chute with explosive bolts as part of the sequence, and Air Force engineering decided that the unique circumstances would never happen again, so they didn't do it, and sure enough, 2 years later it happened again. And I'm pretty certain after the second fatalities, that got fixed, if I remember correctly. The neat thing about that capsule was, and the reason it was in the airplane, was because our speeds were so high at low altitude that no ejection system at the time, no ejection seat at the time, and maybe not even now, would be survivable. And I think the F-111 holds the outdoor freestyle speed record for high-speed ejections. They had one go out at Mach 2.5 on a test flight run, a functional test flight out of Cannon, New Mexico, and no injuries at all. Dave Powell asks, how good was a terrain following radar? That was actually pretty darn good. The airplane would hold a pretty good set clearance plane. We had 200, 2, 3, 400, 700,000. I think those are set clearance planes. It would hold it pretty well. It had a lot of internal fault checking, and so the airplane we didn't too often get what we call a fail-safe fly-up. The airplane had pulled the 4Gs if it detected a failure in the system. And so it was pretty good. We lost a couple in the time I was in the airplane for, well, I don't know, maybe if somebody wants to hear about the accident, I can answer that question. But just talking about the terrain following radar, it was really pretty darn good. And in Desert Storm, we took that thing right down to 200 feet at times. And I got to say that down at 200 feet, even anything below, always below 500, that was more frightening than getting shot at. At least it was for me. And at one point, and I hope I haven't told this story before, one of our low-level missions, we had a radar altimeter looked directly below the airplane, and it did comparisons with there were many reasons why we had a radar altimeter in there, but one of the things was it compared its altitude against the set clearance plane. And it was a 2-channel altimeter, and it sequenced back and forth between them. And one of the radar altimeter channels failed, and it stuck 300 feet, and they get a fly up. And of course, we didn't want to go up because there were some SA-2s in the area. So we went up, we got shot, and if we stayed down, we were likely to hit the ground. Fortunately, we'd practiced flying off the radar display, which I really wish I had some pictures of that. But they called it an E-scope. It was a logarithmic presentation of a very narrow slice of what you would see looking out the front of the airplane, maybe a 3-degree slice of what you would see if you're just looking directly out front. And so it was like, I want to say it was 10 miles, maybe, range. So the first, like I want to say it was like 1 mile was the first half, 3 miles was the middle point of the second half, 6 miles was the middle point of the last quarter. Anyways, very abstract presentation. But once you learned how to interpret it, it was that you could actually fly it at low altitude and not hit something. Extremely stressful, though. I got to say that was the worst part of Desert Storm for me was the minute or so I was hand flying off the E-scope, and I was so wrapped up in that finally the right stater had to say, "Hey, dude, that switch down there, switch channels." Boom. So I switched channels, and the airplane was just good to go. I was just so locked up that it took me a while to get it straight. Freckle Pony makes a comment that the name Aardvark comes from the nose shape. That's very true. It's very reminiscent of the anteater, animal from South Africa. And when I think it was in I want to say 83 or 84, the Air Force decided it was high time to officially name the F-111, because it was the only airplane in the Air Force inventory that had, so far as I know, that didn't have an official name. So they kind of ran a survey of the crews to come up with a name for the airplane. And some of you may have realized remembered a similar survey that happened not too long ago in the UK to name a Antarctic research ship. And sometimes you maybe shouldn't ask the question. You're not sure you want the answer, so they got Bodie McBoatface. Well, the answer to that survey was overwhelmingly Aardvark. And the Air Force decided it was not going to name any airplane Aardvark and just quietly buried the whole thing. The day it retired in 1997, the Air Force officially named it the Aardvark. So, sort of a interesting background on that thing. Steve asked if I was glad I was selected for the F-111. Interestingly, I hope I'm not going to try not to take too long with the story. I was assigned the F-111 out of pilot training. And up until that time, the only way you got an F-111 was you had to have more than 1,000 hours of fighter time to get into the left seat of the 111, or a few guys got put in the right seat as pilot wizzos. And when they got 1,000 hours in the right seat, then they'd move them over to the left seat. And the Air Force ultimately decided that was just not a sustainable model. And so the class I was in pilot training had the very first guys to go to the left seat in the 111. At the pilot training format at the time, you had to be specially selected to be qualified to even be able to ask for a fighter. So I was fighter qualified to ask for it, and I had no idea 111 was even in the offing. No 111 had come down to the base I was at, which is Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma, for more than 2 years. It was an airplane that simply was not in our cross-check. And so it was kind of a surprise a huge surprise when it showed up, and a couple of guys in my class got it. Now, the real question is, am I glad I was selected? Well, I think when people think of fighters, really what we're thinking about is air to air. And I thought of air to air. And the airplane certainly wasn't anything like an air to air airplane. But I'm glad because it put me in some really unique positions, because I was, one of the group of the very first lieutenants to be in the left seat. So I got to do some really unique things, anyway, it was a very unique position to be in. the 111 was kind of, I hope this is a family entertainment word. It was a bastard child in the fighter community until Desert Storm came along, and suddenly the Air Force found out that, holy crap, we really need this thing. And during Desert Storm, I think that's when I would very much rather have been in the F-111, because we reached out and touched things with great amounts of tritinol, while the air-to-air guys are just boring holes in the sky. So I think I'm glad to have done that. As a related question, Haken Engman asks, F for fighter. Why are some military aircraft prefixed with an F when they are not fighters? It's not quite a universal rule, but there is more sense to it than appears to be the case, because, as he mentions, the F-111, F-117, F-35 aren't really fighters in the sense of air-to-air. And the best answer to that question I can come up with is that any aircraft that is in the Air Force that is jet-powered, because we had jet-powered, single-piloted, and has one or two engines, is labeled a fighter. So the B-2 has two engines, but it's not a fighter because it's dual-piloted. The OV-10 was single-piloted, but it had turboprops, so not a fighter. And so that really explains it. It's kind of a design type. The F-111 is far more similar to an F-15 or an F-16 than it is to any non-fighter aircraft, like a KC-135 or a KC-10, something like that. There are a couple of exceptions to the rule. The A-10, dual-engined, two engines, single-piloted, but it's an attack airplane. The A-7, single-piloted, single-engine attack plane. But so that's, you'd think, well, it should have just been the F-10 and the F-7, and I don't have a real good answer for that one. But you think, well, maybe because they don't have afterburners, which is true. So there's another way to look at it. But then the F-117 did have afterburners. It should have been the A-117. Fixed conventions isn't quite chaotic. It does make a little bit of sense. The A's and the F's are all more similar to each other than they are to other airframe types. So that's the only reason I can give. Let's see. Had the Cold War turned hot? This is Freckle Puny again. Had the Cold War turned hot? How many missions do you think you would have gotten through before being defeated by the Warsaw Pact defenses? My entering argument was 3. We really assumed, I've really assumed anyway, that the Warsaw Pact defenses were so good and so thick that we really weren't going to survive. And in fact, when we did exercises, the exercise always kind of followed the same script. The first, it took 2 or 3 days, and then by that time the Warsaw Pact had overrun us, and we had to resort to other weapons, if you know what I'm saying. And I think so. The exercises were a week long, and that's why it was 3 days. After 3 days, we had to go nuclear. I think in the real world, the planners kind of thought that we'd make it 2 weeks. We'd have about 2 weeks before we'd have to resort to a nuclear option or surrender. However, I think it was in the 9. I guess must have been 1988. A MiG-23 took off from a base in Poland, and just after takeoff, the motor popped, and so the pilot jumped out, and then the motor relit, and it's pilotless now, trimmed up, and it just climbed out, and it was heading southwest. And the Soviets completely lost track of the airplane. And it wasn't until about, say, about 30 or so minutes later when our air defense systems were suddenly calling up the Berlin Air Safety Center, which is where we had, there were people from each of the four countries, World War II, four countries all in the same room, including the Soviets. And I was like, hey, there's an airplane coming our way. What's up? You know, what's this airplane doing? And they had no idea what was going on. Well, we realized that it wasn't an attack, so we didn't react that way, but they put an F-15 on the plane. And the F-15 saw it was pilotless, and so now we're trying to decide what to do. We thought, well, if we shoot it down and it hits somebody and kills something, our fault, so we're not going to do anything. And the airplane ran out of gas, I think over in either in Belgium or France. And I'm just, as a tale on that story, if you're an 18-year-old Belgian kid sitting in a French farmhouse and a MiG-23 comes through and kills you, it's your time to go. Just don't even resist. The universe has it in for you, and it's just too bad. Anyway, after that happened, I started, well, one thing that happened just before that, I think the week before, we had a top secret, air quotes, top secret briefing on Warsaw Pact air defense capabilities. And our intelligence community rated them excellent. Well, I don't think an excellent air defense operation can not track an airplane in its own airspace and have no idea where it's going at all. That's just not possible. So I think in retrospect, I think our chances were pretty good that the Soviet systems weren't very well integrated. They weren't very well run, and we really would have, their air defense fighters probably would have had a tough time finding us at all, and their surface air systems just simply weren't good enough. That if they couldn't keep track of an airplane at altitude, they couldn't keep track of us at low level. And even if their air defense systems were good, their target tracking radar are gone. Unless they're an inbound airplane, they'll have no idea where we are until we're gone. Let's see. Somebody asked, I'm sorry, give me a second here to scroll the airplane. Somebody asked about, and I can't remember here, Mike. Sorry, Mike. I scrolled right off the top of the screen. I was based in the UK at Upper Heyford, and we used Cowden Range a lot. It was one of our, partly because it was close. We had Tain. We had Wainfleet Range in the Wash. And Cowden Range was just up the coast from Wainfleet. And there was a third range in the area. This name escapes me right offhand. But yeah, we went to Cowden a lot. And I do have a couple of memories from Cowden. One of them, was my very first tour over there. I was pretty new. No, take that back. It was my second tour over there, so I should have known better. But we were going on Cowden Range, and it was kind of hazy. And there were two targets at Cowden. And so we're radar dropping, and the right seater used one target as an offset aim point for the other. And that we did that so you could be certain that you were hitting they were just like barges. They were orange rafts, iron orange rafts that were probably about 20 feet on the side. Anyway, you used an offset on offset to set the aiming on the other one. That way you could be certain you were actually hitting a target instead of, say, a boat. Well, my right seater used an offset on the target, and we hit a boat. I actually didn't hit the boat. We got really close to it. And the reason was that boat was actually in the range safety area where he shouldn't have been, but his the angle and distance from the first target to the second target was almost exactly the angle and distance from the aim point target to the boat. So my right seater put his cursors on the target we wanted to hit, using it as an offset, and then his radar cursors went to the boat instead of the target. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. We were just massively embarrassed, and I got to do a rug dance in the commander's office later that day. And the other thing that I have a memory of Cowden of, it was coming off target. It was a day where it was very calm, indefinite horizon, and that's actually flying over water under those conditions is actually one of the more dangerous environments. It doesn't seem like it should be, but on a calm day, clear calm day, the sky and the ocean are the same color, and you can't see the horizon. So you could keep your reference. The coast was off to the left by a couple miles, so that, as long as you were in level flight, that was fine. But coming off target, I did what you're not supposed to do ever. We pull up and do about a 130-degree wing over to get down to downwind, and so of course I pull up and I want to see what kind of score I got, because of course we have a quarter on every bomb and it's very competitive, flight of 4 to win the day. And then so I pull off target and I'm looking back to see what I got, and then I noticed something moving where I didn't expect it to be. I looked up and there was a boat in the sky. Well, everybody knows there's not a boat. There are no boats in the sky. But what had happened was I'd rolled over to almost probably about 150 degrees of bank angle, and was just at the apex of the climb. And then if I'd have kept that up any longer, I'd have been going right back down towards the water. I don't think that boat saved my life, but it's possible. You don't know. Glad I don't have to, rewind it and think about it. Let's see. Alexander asks, how long does it take to get your head around to understand the E-scope? The primary usage of the E-scope, there was a very abstract line. That is to say, the terrain returns are very abstract, and that's the only word I can use for it, because you can't, it's almost like seeing the world from the side. But we don't ever really look at the world from the side in terms of the direction we're going. So that's the best. A line that showed that line showed the projected flight vector of the airplane, and it looked kind of like a sideways S, which again is very abstract because it's not necessarily an S at all. But that's just the way when you do a logarithmic depiction, you get a curve instead of a line. And so in normal operation, it was pretty easy to you see the E-scope gave you a picture of what the airplane was going to do, and you cross-check the E-scope, and if there was gap between the ride line and the terrain, then you knew you weren't going to hit it. The problem was if you got a fly up, then that ride line went away, like I mentioned earlier during the Desert Storm mission I had. So you have no ride line anymore. I'm sorry, you do have a ride line. I take that back. You do have a ride line, but now you're having to maintain that gap yourself instead of having the airplane do it for you. But so it was really a combination of the ADI and the E-scope. That was mostly the cross-check. The lead computing optical sight, that was more for visual bombing, and it was a pretty, the other thing it was really good for was airspeed control, because the airspeed was in deviation of knots from whatever you set in it. And I think it was about a 10-knot scale, so you had a real fine on the locus. Let's see. Gordon Webb asked about the F-111 mission video on the channel. That when that was a composite of probably 16 or so hours of videotape I'd shot from the cockpit over many, many missions. And my goal in making that video was to kind of take a typical mission from beginning to end, and from the position of being in the wing and the lead. So it was anyway, that was the goal. And this is right when video editing software was brand new. It was kind of fun to learn how to use. It's not really relevant to the question, though. But in putting that together, I didn't have footage of a single place. So I had takeoff footage from Upper Hayford. The landing footage that I had was from Incirlik, Turkey. And so what shows up there at the end is a day mission I did during Desert Storm. We had an airplane that had an engine problem, and since I was the most experienced pilot in the squadron, I guess that was their reasoning, but they asked me to take it out for a day flight and do a check flight on the airplane to make sure that it was really good to go. Anyway, that last landing was actually at Incirlik, Turkey during Desert Storm. But good observation there, Gordon, that Upper Hayford's runway was 27, 23, definitely not it. Hockey player, yeah, it took me a couple seconds there without all the vowels. Disemboweled your name. Took me a while to figure out what it was. Hockey player 9285 asks, on the D model, when the advanced avionics work, how do they affect pilot workload? Well, gosh, that's going a ways back. The biggest effect on, I'm not thinking on pilot workload, it didn't really have that much effect. It was a glass cockpit, so the glass displays were better than, they're just a bigger attitude indicator. So in that regard, it was pretty good. We had a HUD on the airplane. One of the first I think maybe the F-15. F-15 came into the inventory about the same time I showed up with the 111D, and I think at that point the F-15 and the 111 were the only ones with head displays. Really great for outside day visual flying. Not so much. Really wasn't that useful at night. Where it really helped was with its digital systems, it could much more accurately compute weapons ballistics. And so if you told it what weapon it had, not only did it know the ballistics, but it knew the airplane's acceleration state. Its vector, I guess is actually the correct term. It knew the aircraft vector very well, and it knew the aircraft's location with regard to the target very well. So we could credibly toss a Mark 84 6 miles and have it hit a target the size of a runway. And that was probably one of our prime, that probably would have been our prime use for that, had we ever had to use it, was shutting down airfields. We could probably crater a runway pretty good. But without a laser-guided munitions, which didn't exist at the time, then it was really just better at putting a bomb on target. But as far as workload, not too much effect. And so in that regard, the PaveTac 111F was far more effective than the D model. And really what the F-111D just did a better job of what the F-111E did, really any non-precision weapon airplane had to do, which was solve your vector and your location with respect to the target. And then you had to maneuver in order to hit a target, you had to maneuver the airplane to the exact point in space where the energy state and location of the weapon and the ballistics of the weapon were such that it would fall from the airplane in free fall and hit the target. And as you can guess, that's an extremely difficult problem to solve. And really, and that's why precision guided munitions are such a revolution, because all you have to do is put the airplane in a basket. I can't remember the exact term for it, but just within a ellipsoid, a rotated ellipsoid, such that, and I'm going to get a little. I'm going to see if I can cut that whole term off right there. But all you had to do was get the airplane in a position where the weapon had enough energy and maneuverability to reach the target. And so that took it. And if you're, and so that suddenly becomes a sphere, roughly a sphere in space. It could be a couple, 100 yards on a side, or larger even, depending on the maneuverability of the weapon. A Mark 84 precision-guided munition isn't going to be as maneuverable as a Mark 82, for instance. But that's all you had to do, and then it could maneuver to the target, and that was just a huge difference in airplane and attack effectiveness. So any non-PGM airplane just won't even be close. Dave asked the typical all-up weight on a mission. Our practice missions. This is Dave Powell, by the way. The airplane is 50,000 pounds empty. Zero fuel weight was about 50,000 pounds. And on a typical training mission, we'd go full internal and wing tanks, and that went to about another 30,000. So our normal training weight was 80,000 pounds. During Desert Storm, we carried one of our popular loads towards the end, particularly was 12 Mark 82s on station, mounted on racks on stations 2 and 4, and then a Mark 84 on, was it Mark 84? I think it might have been a Mark 84 on stations 3 and 4. And the reason you could do that is because they're slick weapons, and as we all know from, Galileo, objects fall at the same rate in an Earth's gravitational field, regardless of how heavy they are. So they had basically the same range. And so the 12 of those 82s were 6,000 pounds, and then you added another 4,000, so 10,000 pounds of ordnance. And 90,000 pounds. Let's see. Dan Oliveira asks if there's something to add on the daily life and flying the 111. And gosh, that's a question where I'm going to put that aside, because it's very difficult for me to talk and think at the same time, and there's got to be a million of them. Here's one just popped into my mind. And it's kind of trivial, don't know why it showed up, but here it is. After Desert Storm, the command authorized incentive flights for all the ground crew. So every maintainer, every squadron, every person in the squadron, everyone, we gave them about a 45-minute, and it was not a cheap flight either. It was about a 45-minute flight around the what we called the 50-mile circle. And the Turkish government allowed us to fly just about wherever we wanted to, so long as we remained within 50 miles of Incirlik. And so we'd take off, head south, probably west-southwest until we were out over the Med, and then we'd drop down to low level and go supersonic. So all of our ground troops got a supersonic run, and then we went up into the mountains north of Incirlik, and which were pretty rugged, and so that was a huge, great show. It was a really great flight. I'm glad we could do it, but maybe I'd like to think I'm not sociopathic, but other people may disagree. Anyway, one of the flights that I did about 6 of these, I think, over over the space of a couple of days. And we also took up all the people who were in the Patriot, all the Army guys in the Patriot missile battery that protected the airfield. So I took the lieutenant that was in charge of that, and I noticed he was a little bit had some flying anxieties a little bit, and particularly when the airplane made noises, like when the gear retracted. I noticed when the speed brake slammed shut, because that's also the main gear door, he flinched really good. And I have to admit, I may have fanned that speed brake a few times during the mission, during his incentive flight, just to see the reaction. Not, a lot of times, but a few times. So, it's one of my stories that just jumped into view for who knows what reason. Steve asks about dropping Durandal. We had a capability with the airplane. We had them in our, that was one of the loads we had. We had ballistics for, and we didn't. And I'm glad we didn't, because I think it was fundamentally a foolish weapon. And it because of its design, in the way it was supposed to work, you had to fly right down the runway center line, right at 300 feet, and it didn't take the Iraqis very long to figure that out. And that, I think, we had probably lost 3 tornadoes during Desert Storm and the cruise because of that absolutely getting railroaded into the absolutely the most predictable delivery tactic you could ever have. So I'm glad we didn't drop them. So Carp Comet asks a question: how well laid out or user friendly was the cockpit? I'd say in some regards it's pretty good. As far as flying the airplane goes, it was a little bit of an unusual layout for fighters, because there were tape gauges for altitude, airspeed, and vertical velocity. And you could bug these things. And so if you were, like, you could bug your altitude and airspeed. Oh, and angle of attack. Angle of attack was another tape gauge. So your altitude and your airspeed, or your anyway, it was sorry, getting a little disorganized here in my response. It was a very easy cross-check, because you just scanned left and right. And when you were on your parameters, everything lined up. So you didn't even, your peripheral vision was much more useful than would ordinarily be the case. When you're instrument flying, you get a little bit of a technical point here. Your field of vision has something called, I want to say somebody's going to tell me here that I got this wrong, the phobia. Anyway, the area, you have about a 3-degree area a 3-degree cone in your field of vision that you actually see at whatever your eyesight is rated be, say 20/20. And you move 3 or 4 or 5 degrees off of that, and you go from 20/20 to 2200. And so whenever you're flying most airplanes of the time, you'd actually have to you'd have to look at all your instruments individually and keep a scan going, because they're in different places. And in the 111, the fact that you could bug things and keep them a straight line, you could detect movement even if it wasn't in your peripheral vision, or even if it wasn't what you were directly looking at. So I could fly like we would do. Our most precise approach in the airplane was a PAR called a precision approach radar. And we'd get talked down by a ground controller who would say, come right, come left, above glide slope, below glide slope, and he would give us headings and increase or decrease the rate of descent. And because the heading was the attitude direction indicator was a full 360-degree freedom of motion ball that was the artificial horizon. The heading was right there on the horizon line. So everything was right there. And I could fly that airplane to within a degree and a couple of knots. A degree of heading, a couple of knots airspeed, and 10, 15 feet per minute of descent rate of desired, easily. And so we could get talked down to 100 feet above the ground and break out and be right at the radar. I'm flying the 767 right now. That airplane's not designed to be hand flown, and you could never. I don't think anybody could fly a modern airliner with the way the information, your heading, altitude, vertical velocity information, the way it's laid out, particularly heading, you could never do that. So in that regard, an older airplane was much easier, much more user-friendly than you'd think. The last part of the question was, how was outward visibility during landing? The outward visibility during landing was actually pretty good. The nose, if you're doing a no-flap approach, the deck angle, our deck angle was pretty high. Like if you're like airliners land at about a 5-degree deck angle. Partly because if you land any more, you'd smack the back of the airplane. Fighters, because they have a less efficient wing than airliners do, at lower speeds, we have a higher angle of attack. So it's about 10 degrees of deck angle. And at a no-flap approach, it'd be 11. And about that point, you're starting to lose the runway a little bit in front of the nose. But it wasn't really that bad. Not something I noticed much, that's for sure. Okay, Freckle Puny has a good question. Given the release of Top Gun this coming summer, I've seen a couple of the trailers for it. It looks, considering how corny Top Gun was, at least I thought it was corny. It was within its genre, it was a pretty darn good Tom Cruise has his oddball moments, I guess, but he delivers the goods. When he gets on screen, he is a consummate actor, and he's also aged pretty well. To look at the guy, you got to admit that too. Anyway, the question about is, I've said the 111's not agile. How different would the original Top Gun have been had the F-111B entered service of the F-14? I'm not sure. I think the problem with the F-111 was it was extremely high wing loading. And that was a consequence both of the mission, which was long range, which meant you carry a lot of fuel. So the airplane itself was, at 50,000 pounds. That's not a light airplane, but it has to be that weight if you're going to have a structure big enough to put a lot of fuel in. And a variable geometry wing, by definition, is not going to be a very big wing. It's going to be a narrow wing, much narrower if you look like an F-15. An F-15 doesn't weigh a lot less than an F-111, but the wing area of the F-15 must be at least twice what it is on the 111. So the 111B would have been probably about the same weight. So obviously that's a problem, but I'm not sure how much less agile it was than the F-14. Because the F-14 has the same issue with the variable geometry wing. It had higher wing loading than any other fighter in its class. And so I don't think an F-14 would have ever, in a dogfight, if you'd have been a dogfight between, an F-15 or F-16, a visual dogfight, F-14 would have just gotten creamed. So it was really primarily a Phoenix missile hauler. That was its original mission, was a Phoenix missile hauler for fleet defense. And in that regard, the 111B would have done just as well as the F-14 did, and maybe even better, perhaps could have done. But with regard to Top Gun, I'm not sure the movie would have ever been made, not so much because of agility issues, because you can fake anything in the movies. but rather the F-14 is just the most awesome, not the best look. I think the F-15 is probably the best looking fighter that has ever been made, but the F-14 is the most awesome looking fighter that's ever been made. Just to look at the thing, there's not an angle on that airplane where it's just not awe-inspiring. And that, I think, as much as anything, is why Top Gun got made. It's just such an incredible looking airplane. That and and all the visuals that go along with the Navy thing. So let's see. Mike asks, I think you meant to say, Mike asked, did the 111 have a special valve to prevent blowback when dumping fuel? No, that was the fuel dump system was, gosh, man, you're taking me back. I think it was a combination of air pressure from the bleed. Yeah, it was bleed off the engines would pressurize the tanks. And it was a combination of that and fuel pumps, I think. But man, that's taking me back. I can't remember that for sure. But just there was no real worry about blowback when dumping fuel. It just came out like a torrent. And I'm sure you've all seen pictures of the torching that seemed to be the F-111's primary mission, actually, not long range, low altitude interdiction, but torching at air shows.
So Jeff, Jeff, we're just gonna wrap up now. So if you want to pick two more questions to answer.
Two more questions.
Yeah, perfect.
Let's see. Well, let's see. I'm going to see if I can pick somebody. Apparition 13. Side-by-side seating supposedly improves crew communication, but I said it, but I prefer tandem, and I also have said in the past I prefer tandem seating for visibility reasons. The biggest reason I can think of, I guess I think I'm assuming a reason here, that we had side-by-side seating in the 111 was because at the time, in order to get a radar of sufficient detail, radar image of sufficient detail, you had to have a pretty wide dish. And so the width of the attack radar dish drove the width. And it's because we wanted, to get a really accurate image at low altitude, it had to be a big dish. It made the front of the airplane big. And in order to fare in the front of the air, that is why the nose was so long. And because the airplane had to be wide because of the attack radar dish, and you couldn't have tandem seating because it really wouldn't make sense because it would make the airplane even longer, and you wouldn't be able to see over the side in any event. So the attack radar really drove a whole lot of things in regard to just that side-by-side cockpit. Anyway, I don't think that's the only reason we had it. I don't think it really improved crew communication much. And certainly, given a choice, I'd prefer tandem seating so you could see, because the visibility out of the airplane was, by fighter standards, was probably the only plane worse than the F-111 would have been the F-117. Let's see. One last question here from Phil Collins. So I'll leave with this one, talking a little bit about the maneuverability F-111. The F-111, the fighter version, was a 7.3G airplane. The wing loading of the airplane was so high that if you were to make a level turn, you could just the G's you could initially pull by the hundreds of knots you were going. So at 600 knots, I could pull a 6G turn. Couldn't hold it, but I could initially hit 6Gs. If I was 500 knots, it'd be about a little bit more than 5 Gs. at that G loading with the airplane, with the wing loading the way it was, you'd lose 50 knots a second. So your initial 6G turn in the space of 2 seconds would be 5 Gs, and 4 seconds would be 3 Gs, just because the airplane was just, it just turned into a flying speed brake the moment you yanked on it really hard. Now, if you went full burner and had some altitude and did a slice back, you go to 130-degree bank and use God's G to help you out, then that would be a different thing. But it really, you just could not pull and hold very many Gs. And as Jeremy Clarkson would say, on that disappointment, Mike's telling me it's time to wrap it up. I really want to thank everybody for coming by and putting up with me again, and it was a great time. I really enjoyed doing this. And Mike, you put on a great channel you got going here.
Oh, well, thanks very much, Jeff. It's very much appreciated coming from yourself, and as always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on, because I know our viewers absolutely love hearing from you and getting this live interaction. But I'm sure next year we're going to have to get you on again, because as you can see, there's so many questions that came in. Unfortunately, we're trying to stick to this hour thing. But hopefully next year, Jeff, we can get you on if that's possible.
Oh, I'm sure it'll be possible. And in terms of like a theme of wrapping up as we reach the top of the hour with just a minute to go according to my clock, I'm sad to say this. I mean this truly. I'm really sad to say that I'll have plenty of time in my schedule in the coming year, because I am, as of the middle of April, I'm getting put in the knacker's yard. And you Brits may know this is not a term familiar to Americans. It's one I learned when I was in England. But the knacker's yard is a place where they put old horses just before they turn them into glue.
Very degrading yourself there, Jeff.
So I am an old horse, and in the middle of April I will turn 65. And in the United States, that's a regulated retirement age for airline pilots. So not only are we putting a wrap on this show today, also announcing that I'm putting a wrap on my career in the not too distant future.
Well, I think it's well deserved. A good rest after an awesome career, Jeff. But thank you very much again for coming on, and obviously we'll stay in contact and get something sorted for next year. But I'm going to wish you a very happy Christmas wherever you are. I know you're very busy at the moment, but wishing you a happy Christmas and a new year. But thank you again, Jeff.
Okay, over and out. Bye-bye, Mike.
Cheers. Right, we are finished there, Jeff.